Summer is here in California, and it's time for me to go back to Quince and order some summer shorts. Quince European linen pants and shirts are also perfect for a warm weather upgrade to add to your rotation, starting at just $34. Their tees are soft and easy to wear, and their lightweight cotton sweaters are perfect for cooler summer nights. I just hit checkout on a pair of Clubhouse golf shorts, which I think will be good for traveling, and I don't even golf. Quince also goes way beyond clothing. They have custom upholstered sofas, ceramic cookware, premium bedding. They work directly with ethical factories and cut out the middleman, so you're paying for quality, not brand markup. Everything at Quince is priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Elevate your summer wardrobe. Go to quince.com/traveler for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's quince.com/traveler for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. This episode is sponsored by Smart Travel, a new podcast from NerdWallet. You know that one friend who always finds the best travel deals, picks the right cards, and somehow ends up in first class for the price of coach? Smart Travel is like that friend, but in podcast form. They cover all things finance, like how to book busy season trips without the busy season sticker shock, which airport lounges are worth it and which are basically free Wi-Fi and chairs, how travel advisors can snag secret perks you don't even know to ask for, and how to get real value from points, not just a tiny reward at checkout. The nerds at NerdWallet know this stuff better than me, and that's why I feel great about recommending the Smart Travel podcast. After all, we nerds have to stick together. Travel smarter and spend less with the help from NerdWallet. Follow Smart Travel wherever you get your podcasts. Amateur Traveler, episode 1000. Today on Amateur Traveler, we talk about mosques, minarets, and madrasas, Persians, Parthians, and Plav as we go to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan with listeners of the show. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Welcome to the 1000th episode. Let's talk about Central Asia. This episode of Amateur Traveler is both a normal episode and a very special episode. It is a special episode because it is episode 1000, and I never thought I would get here. It is a normal episode because I'm going to do what I've done for 999 other episodes, and that's talk about a destination and a particular itinerary. To be honest, there have been more than 1,000 episodes of Amateur Traveler, but this is the 1,000th standard episode. There have been some special episodes that get other numbers. This episode, though, is going to talk about the latest Amateur Traveler trip. So I did this trip with a small group, only 4 listeners of the show. Tom and Susan and Bill and Crystal joined me on this G Adventures trip to Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And I think at least one of them will be joining me on this show. The trip that we took was the best of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. I should mention, though, that there was another G Adventures trip that was parallel to ours for the entire length of the trip, and that was a 5-stand trip. I know some of you didn't go on this particular trip because you wanted to do all 5 stands. G Adventures does do that trip as well. Although I will say that by the time we get to Turkmenistan, some of the members of that group seemed like they had gotten a little tired. I noticed, for instance, at one restaurant, only 2 of the 8 that were left in that group went out to dinner. The other 6 stayed at the hotel. So that is a longer trip, obviously. Before I get much further, I should talk about why you should do this trip. In this area, you can stand in these beautiful cities that date back over 2,000 years. This is a trip through some of the great crossroads of world history. Persian Empire, Silk Road merchants, Turkic tribes, Mongol armies, Timurid architects, Russian generals, Soviet planners, and 2 very different modern countries. This is not the edge of the map as we tend to view it, but historically it's the middle of the map. It's the middle of the world, and a lot of different cultures connected here. It's a fascinating place. So we did Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. These are two of the five stands. We did not go to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or Tajikistan. One thing to know about this region is that both Uzbek and Turkmen are Turkic languages, so they have some things in common. They're also both predominantly Muslim countries. The other places where you'll find Turkic languages include Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, the Uyghurs in western China, Tatarstan north of Kazakhstan and Russia, the Altai Republic north of Mongolia in Russia, which is probably where the Turks came from originally, as well as Azerbaijan and Turkey. Interestingly enough, at least interesting to me, is that fifth stand that is not Turkic-speaking Tajikistan has a language that is Persian-based, as is the language in Afghanistan and in Iran, and then also the language of the Kurds. There are Turks all over the place, and in this region there are other groups as well, because this has been a melting pot for centuries. I like to start by doing a little history to give some people some grounding in this area. The problem is this area has too darn much history. And so I really want you to just remember 5 particular points in time that impacted this area. So before Alexander the Great comes through, this is predominantly a Persian-dominated area, with the main religion being Zoroastrianism, which still has some impact on the area. And so Alexander comes through in the 300s BC, and we get the start of Hellenization in this area, where there's influence by the Greek culture. And then the next major timeline that I'd want you to remember is that the Arab caliphates come into the area around the 700s. And that's one of the things that makes this a predominantly Muslim region. The other major thing that affects this region is the Mongols invade in the 1200s and devastate large portions of this region, including some cities that we'll talk about. And so after that, much of this region breaks into individual khanates. A khan being someone who claims descending from Genghis Khan, or emirates, people who don't claim to descend from Genghis Khan. And then the next big thing that happens that I think you should remember is the Russian Empire comes in. The Russian Empire comes in the late 1800s. The British and the Russians were both trying to get in this area in what's called the Great Game. The British were trying to protect their interests in India, but largely the Russians won in this area, and so they took over. And then obviously, as the Russian Empire turns into the Soviet Union, the Red Army moves through in the early 1920s. And then the other major date to keep in mind is 1991, and that's when both Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, as well as some of these other stands, gain their independence when the Soviet Union breaks up. Those are the 5 main dates, and as we talk about various places that we went to, I'm going to try and relate them to those 5 dates, so I only want you to remember those things. But there's all sorts of different empires and khanates and things that have come through this region. Each of the individual cities we went to in Uzbekistan was more than 2,000 years old, so there's a lot of history here. The broad outline of our itinerary was starting in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, going to Samarkand, a yurt camp, Bukhara, and Khiva, and then crossing over into Turkmenistan, where we did Dashaguz, the Darvaza Gates of Hell gas crater, and then Ashgabat, where we ended the trip. We started on May 18th and finished on May 30th. For reference, the 5-stand trip started on May the 5th, so they started 13 days earlier. So we did 9 days in Uzbekistan and 4 in Turkmenistan. So we started in Tashkent. As I mentioned, Tashkent is a more modern city because while it is over 2,000 years old, quite a lot of it was destroyed in an earthquake in 1966. So it was rebuilt as a predominantly Russian-styled city. And I would say that I really liked the order that we did Uzbekistan from Tashkent to Khiva because it got more and more interesting as we went along. I thought the highlight would be Samarkand. That was the Silk Road city that sort of stuck in my brain as the most interesting city in the Silk Road. And honestly, it got better even after that. Tashkent itself is the capital city, a lot of new things there. Also, this particular trip doesn't cover Tashkent. So if you want to spend more time in Tashkent, you have to do what other people in the trip did, which is come in a little early. If you come in early, or if you arrive early in the morning, at least like I did, you have some time to spend in Tashkent. Some of the things to see there are the Soviet style underground stations, which are pretty in themselves, the central market, which is in an interesting domed building a little further out of town, reachable by the underground there, reachable by the subway. And then Independence Square and those buildings. There are also some interesting museums in the city. The favorite museum of the people who came in earlier than me was the State Museum of Applied Arts, which is a museum close to the hotel where we were staying, the Harris Hotel. I'll put a link in the show notes to my review of that hotel. And this had traditional crafts, ceramics, textiles, jewelry, and decorative arts, and was popular with the group. And let me, at this point, introduce one of the members of the group who will help me tell this story. I'd like to welcome back to the show Bill Abbott, who has been on the show before, way back in the day, doing an episode on Guangzhou. And
Thank you.
Bill, welcome to Amateur Traveler. Bill and his wife
I don't
Crystal
think
both
you
joined
got
me
to
on this trip.
go to the museum that was right next to our hotel.
No, I didn't. This is the art museum, but it's a how do I want to say it? The cultural
Yes,
art of
I think
the
it's called
country.
Applied Arts, the Museum of Applied Arts in Tashkent.
Yep.
And I thought that was really a good way to start off our trip. It didn't take a long time to go through there. The hotel that we stayed at, the Harris Hotel, was in this very nice area surrounded by all of these embassies and consulates, and the museum was right in that area, like a 5-minute walk from the hotel. So I thought that was really worth it.
There's also the Amir Timur Museum. Timur is somebody we will talk more about when we get to Samarkand. The museum here features history from his time period, which is post Genghis Khan. He establishes one of the most important khanates after Genghis Khan. And the State Museum of History of Uzbekistan. The evening of the trip, we had our organizational meeting and then actually went out to a local restaurant in a nearby park. Some beautiful parks in the area. A couple big surprises with Tashkent. Was much greener than I expected. The eastern side of Uzbekistan is green, and as you go west, you go more into the desert. Also, that almost every car on the road was a white Chevy. There's a Chevy factory in Uzbekistan. In Turkmenistan, they were white Toyotas, but almost all the cars we saw in both countries were white because it gets hot in the desert. Tashkent is a thoroughly modern city, and for the opening dinner, we went to a nearby park and ate at one of a series of lovely restaurants along the park, and this is the Park 5 Tashkent, I believe is the name of it. Beautiful park, some lovely restaurants, and I would say just starting with the very first dinner, thoroughly enjoyed the food in both countries. I think I had one disappointing meal in the whole trip that I can think of, and that was at a mall, at a food court, so that's a little less surprising. Some similarities between the cooking in both countries. We had kebabs and plav, which is a rice-based dish, round breads, especially tandoori, dumplings, pastries, soups, teas, salads, melon, those sort of things. Also pide, which is a Turkish-style pizza-like bread and cheese dish. And then the first official thing we did on the trip was we hopped on a train from Tashkent and took it to Samarkand. Samarkand, again, not the desert that I was expecting. Big tree-lined streets in Samarkand that date back to the Russian period. Samarkand has a number of important monuments that are relatively spread out. So from our hotel, and again, I'll put a link in the show notes to my review of the hotel we had in Samarkand. We stayed at the Hotel Karvan, and from there we could walk to the main Rajasthan, which is the structure that you've probably seen pictures of if you've seen pictures of Samarkand, and that is a square that on three sides has important buildings. On the right and the left, it has two madrasas, and then in the center, it has a mosque. And a lot of the buildings that we saw had a very similar style, which is a great big entry portal with tile work above it, a pointed arched entryway in a square facade, and then quite often to the right and left of that, you'd have minarets on the madrasas as well as on the mosques. And that was a very similar style that we would see on mausoleums and we'd see on madrasas and we'd see on mosques in this region. And all of the major buildings that we saw in Samarkand are post Genghis Khan, and especially from the Khanate of Timur or Tamerlane. Timur is born in the 1300s and founds a dynasty that includes a noted astronomer, his grandson, as well as his great grandson, who founds the Mughal Empire when he invades India. He was a patron of the arts, but he was also a very capable, undefeated military leader, but also brutal and deadly. And so, for instance, when we got to Uzbekistan, he was well regarded because this is where he ruled. When we got to Turkmenistan, he was not well regarded because they were on the wrong end of those conquests. The three buildings in the square date from left to right from the 1400s, the 1600s, and the 1600s. This used to be the major square in the city. It's where announcements happened, it's where executions happened, and the name literally means place of sand. And sand, in part, probably because of the executions, it would soak up the blood in the same way that the name for arena goes back to the word for sand, where the gladiators fought in Rome. But this is a beautiful area. The artistry on the different buildings, and this is very similar to what we saw elsewhere, is a lot of very beautiful tile work. The one surprising thing is that the madrasa on the right, the newer of the two madrasas, has in the front of it animals on the face, which is not something I expected to see on an Islamic madrasa. Madrasa, a school for studying theology, but also medicine and other studies. But it has some lions, which look more like tigers to me, and also the symbols of Zoroastrian goddess there, which shows that there's still some of that Zoroastrian flavor left even by the 1600s, 900 years after Islam comes to this region. Inside of the madrasas, you found people selling their wares, and apparently that isn't entirely out of place. We were told by our guide, we had two guides on this trip. Our guide in Uzbekistan was Mohammed, that the students who went to the madrasa would only go for 6 months of the year, so the madrasa would be empty the rest of the time and was often used as a sort of caravanserai where people would be selling their wares. And so this isn't entirely different. The one thing I liked in the newer madrasa, the one on the right, is if you go back in the back right corner, there are pictures of this region and this square from the early days of the Russians, and it is very, very different looking. It is not a modern looking city. People are in very different dress, and it is just an interesting time capsule. So go back in that corner when you get to Registan Square. We had a day and a half in Samarkand, and some of that was on our own. The things that we visited that are part of the trip is also a visit to the mausoleum of Timur, where he and some of his sons are buried, which is, again, another building of that same, with the dome above it, a main square entrance with the arch in it, and then two pillars on the side, or two minarets on the side. We also went to the area called Shah-e-Zinda, which is a necropolis. It's an area of mausoleums that date pre and post Mongol invasion. And it's right on the edge of a hill. And that hill is the remains of the city that was there at the time of the Mongol invasion. There's a museum at the top of the hill, which I walked past but didn't go in because I didn't know what it was at the time. But if you want to know more about what was here before Genghis Khan came, that would be the museum to find out. And we also went as a group to the Bibi Khanim Mosque, which is named by Timur after one of his favorite wives. It was, in the 15th century, one of the largest mosques in the world, was in ruins, and then was largely rebuilt during the Soviet period. And near there, which I visited on my own, is the mausoleum for Bibi Khanim and also the Central Market. That area is connected to the Rajasthan Square via a tree-lined avenue, and there are taxis that ply that route if you want to go from one to the other. And close to that area also is another mosque and then the mausoleum of the first president of Uzbekistan. The other side of the ancient city, if you go north, and I did these on my own, is the observatory of Ulaybey. And that was a grandson of Timur, who was a scientist and astronomer whose work is recognized worldwide in the astronomy community as one of the early astronomers. Was not as popular, though, with his people and was assassinated. The other thing that we saw over in that area north of that old city mound is the Prophet Daniel Mausoleum. The story goes that Timur was having trouble conquering a region, and he was told it was because the bones, or at least some of the bones, of the prophet Daniel from the Bible were there, and so he sent people to go steal them. It is very odd, though, if you go in the mausoleum, you have to pay extra to do that. You will see a very, 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 very long sarcophagus. And there are different reasons why that might be so long. Some say that people in Daniel's days were giants. That seems unlikely. Then others say they didn't know where to dig for the bones, and so they had some margin for error there, or they've been growing. I don't think any of those are probably very likely, but there is the Prophet Daniel Mausoleum there. It's not much to see. It is of at least historic significance. I should mention I walked all the way over to the observatory, but I don't really recommend that. It's quite a long walk, and it was a warm day, and you can get around more easily in Uzbekistan by using the Yandex Go app. And that lets you call a cab for a prearranged amount. The cab ride back to our hotel was 12,000 baht, and it's 12,000 baht to the dollar, so less than $2 for almost any cab ride I did in the city. Of course, if you use an app, you don't have to speak any Uzbek. The only Uzbek I learned was Rahmat, which means thank you. I was trying to negotiate with a cab that I found at the Prophet Daniel Mosque, and they wanted 40,000 or 50,000 baht to get back to the hotel. Again, that's still not that much money. So while I said I enjoyed some of the cities later on, Samarkand by no means disappointed. This is a fantastic city, both in terms of the street life, the restaurants, and of course, these architectural monuments. They are a bit spread out compared to some of the other cities. Our next day, we got into a van and drove out into the hinterlands. That night, we were going to spend at a yurt camp, but on the way, we made two interesting stops. One was the Chashma complex near Narada, and that is the remains of an old fortress from the time of Alexander the Great. So obviously very eroded, hard to see a lot of it, but you can still make out where the wall used to be. So fascinating to me because we're talking about 2,300 years ago. And then we also stopped at a lake there, Idar Kul Lake, where we could have gone swimming, but it was a little chilly and very breezy there on the steppe. So we chose not to do that. And then the stay in the yurt camp, I wasn't sure what to expect there. I was surprised that we had both electricity and Wi-Fi at the yurt camp and a decent meal. And then there was a performance of some musicians that night doing traditional songs. So an interesting stay. We had bounced all around a lot on dirt roads that day, so I was a little exhausted by the time we got there. When people hear that Mint Mobile plans are only $15 per month, a lot of people wonder, what's the catch? Well, I can tell you, there isn't one. There are no gimmicks and no gotchas, just unlimited talk, text, and data, fast, reliable coverage on the nation's largest 5G network, and an award-winning care team. I guess that makes Mint Mobile a catch. You can even bring your current phone and your number, choose from 3, 6, or 12-month plans, and say goodbye to a monthly bill. Before Mint Mobile asked about being a sponsor in the show, I was already looking at Mint Mobile because what they offer, the same towers, the same service for less money, was something that appealed to me. After years of overpaying for wireless, I finally got fed up with crazy high wireless bills, bogus fees, and free perks that actually cost more in the long run. So I ask you, don't you have something better to do with your money? To get your wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/traveler. That's mintmobile.com/traveler. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/traveler. That's it. There's no catch. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on an unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. And thanks to Mint Mobile for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. As I've mentioned before, being a guy, and especially of my generation, skincare was not something we really focused on. OneSkin has become a part of my daily routine, and I do like the way that it makes my skin feel. We've talked about OneSkin before and why it stands out. It's not hype or fancy packaging, it's real science. The founders are longevity researchers who developed OS1, a proprietary peptide designed to target zombie cells, which are linked to visible skin aging like wrinkles and loss of elasticity. Instead of just masking signs of aging, OneSkin works at the source to support healthier, stronger skin. Born from over a decade of longevity research, OneSkin's OS1 peptide is proven to target the visible signs of aging, helping you unlock your healthiest skin now and as you age. For a limited time, try OneSkin with 15% off using code TRAVELER at oneskin.co/traveler. That's 15% off oneskin.co with code TRAVELER. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Please support this show and tell them I sent you. And remember, Traveler is spelled with one L the U.S. way. And thanks to OneSkin for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. And then we proceeded on the next day, again in the van, to Bukhara. On the way to Bukhara, we made a stop at a caravanserai. So caravanserais were where your caravan would go for the night to shelter and to feed your animals and get some water. And they were roughly every 20 miles along the Silk Road, or the Silk Roads. Really, there are multiple different routes here. But Bukhara being, again, another major city on the Silk Road. And we talk about the Silk Road. The things that were traded on the Silk Road included horses going in all directions, but that was one of the things that China wanted, as well as silver. But then coming in the other direction were silk and paper, and then there were slaves also being traded on the Silk Road as well, and spices, of course. I quite enjoyed Bukhara. One of the things about Bukhara is that the main downtown is a pedestrian area. So all of the major monuments that we saw on the old city walk there, the mosques and the madrasas and the trading domes and such, were within this pedestrian area that was filled with shops and bazaars and a puppet place where we got both a performance and got to see how they did traditional puppets in the area, and little ponds with tables for restaurants around them. So a very beautiful, very touristy feeling, but very comfortable space because you didn't have to worry about dodging traffic or anything like that. So I quite loved Bukhara, even though when we were there, we ran into some rain. We expected hot weather on all this trip and had more rain than we expected. We were there in May. When we got to Bukhara, we did an unofficial stop on the trip, which was we went out to the Summer Palace, and I quite enjoyed that. So this is something that was built by the last of the emirs before the Russians came. It was a palace that was more modern, therefore, and more European looking. Reminded me a lot of the Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul, but very beautiful artwork in terms of the sculpted ceilings and the tile work. There were peacocks there, and again, reflecting ponds, and very beautiful. The emirs were living well. And then the next day, we started the morning with the official tour of the city. And I should say that both Samarkand and Bukhara are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. We started at the Ismail Samani Mausoleum, and this dates back pre-Mongols. It goes back to one of the Persian empires, the Samanid Empire in the 10th century. And it's not a very large mausoleum, but again, beautiful tile work, beautiful carvings, and set in a park-like area. Not far from there was a building called the Spring of Job, tied to the prophet Job from the Old Testament. One of the most significant sites is the Po-e Kalyan complex, and this is one of the most visited places in the city, with a madrasa and a mosque, as well as a minaret that's 157 feet high. And again, the whole minaret all the way up has this intricate tile work on it. So it's quite lovely, as a number of these were. And again, these mosques with the madrasa with the two turquoise colored domes. That's really a common color we saw in a lot of the different domes around this region, if I haven't mentioned it before. The Ulugbeg Madrasa still has students there. Only the minaret is from pre-Genghis Khan. The rest was rebuilt in the 1500s. And then the Ark of Bukhara. And the Ark is the fortress and fortified palace of the old rulers of Bukhara. And so that's absolutely worth a visit. Inside the Ark, you'll find a small history museum. You'll find an area that the archaeologists haven't dug up yet. And then you'll be inside of these walls, kind of interesting sloping walls. They're not straight up and down, but have an angle of maybe 60 degrees. The Red Army captured the city and the Ark in the 1920s during the Russian Civil War. We went to a couple other caravanserais there, and in and around that are, as I said, shops and restaurants and tea houses and ice cream shops. And then we stayed nearby in the Istat Boutique Hotel, which was walking distance then from that major pedestrian area. And I'll put a link in the show notes again to my review for that hotel. I quite loved Bukhara. When we were there, it was my favorite city so far. But we weren't done yet. We did the long drive to Khiva. The road's getting a little worse as we got closer to Khiva. We definitely had some bad highways in various places on this trip, even more so once we got to Turkmenistan. The historic part of Khiva is a walled city, and we stayed within that walled city, and so it was quite special that way. We actually stayed in a madrasa, and so my room was two of the old madrasa cells where the students would live in. I don't know if cell's quite the right word there, that had been converted into a comfortable hotel room. And then part of the next one had been converted into a bathroom, although you had to get under a 2-foot thick wall that was built low, and kept knocking my head to go into the bathroom at night because it was probably a 5-foot tall opening, both at the door to my room and also the door to the bathroom. But very cool staying in this very historic building within this very historic city. And Khiva was the first site in Uzbekistan to be on the World Heritage List. So another UNESCO site. And this was its own Khanate, the Khanate of Khiva, for a long period of time, from the 1500s right up until the Red Army came in 1920. And again, all of these cities being old, Khiva is over 2,500 years old. And is supposedly founded by Shem, the son of the prophet Noah. So you have to pay an entrance to go into this city, but of course that's included in the package here, as well as the entrance to a number of the different museums, including a museum about the science and the sort of proto-university that happened here for a short period of time, as well as the palace, and the mosque. There's a mosque there with a forest of pillars that reminded me of the mosque in Cordoba in Spain, except that these pillars are wooden carved pillars, but again, that come from a variety of places, so they're different heights and have been made to fit inside this mosque. There's a short minaret as well as some very tall minarets. There's kind of an unfinished one, which is all covered in reflective blue tiles, so quite pretty. When we visited that unfinished minaret, they were filming a Bollywood movie there, so that was something you don't expect. You can get up and walk about half of the walls of Kiva, so we did that early in the morning. Unfortunately, you're walking in the area that is the furthest away from some of the mosques and madrasas with the minarets, so we weren't quite as near where I wanted to be. We really didn't explore outside the city at all because there was so much to see inside of the old city of Kiva. Good shopping there as well. Lots of different vendors selling things in the city, including some hats that looked like they were a broader, shorter version of the hats that the guards wear at Buckingham Palace, which are traditional hats. There is another fortress, and that's the Konya Ark. There was a building which was the harem of one of the emirs. You could see how the emir's area, the sort of a patio or courtyard, was larger, and then the first wives was a little smaller, and the second wives and the third wives and the fourth wives got a little smaller than that. And it was quite hot by the time we got to Kiva, so we enjoyed exploring some of that early in the morning. And by this point, we're really in the desert. So there was really no question that in that drive to Kiva, you are no longer just in grasslands, but there are more dunes and such around. And it felt more like you were staying inside of the Arabian Nights at this point. The mosque with the forest of pillars is the Juma Mosque. I didn't mention that. And you can climb the minaret, the tallest of the minarets in Kiva. Some of the members of the group did. I didn't. Our guide actually didn't recommend it too highly. He said the steps were very irregular, and he had at least one guest who fell while climbing that, so he couldn't recommend it with great enthusiasm. But it apparently offered great views of the city. And this is what Bill had to say about that. And then I'm thinking you did a couple things that I didn't do. You went up in the
I did.
minaret in Kiva, and I didn't do that. So tell me what it was like. I know that Yusuf was saying he was a little worried about us going up there because the steps were uneven. And he had a guest who didn't master the steps,
Yeah,
let's
the
just
steps
say.
were really a bit difficult both ways. In fact, I think coming down was even tougher than going up.
Yeah.
Luckily, there weren't a lot of people when I got up to the top. I think there were only 4 other people, and there wasn't a lot of space up there for more than that. And then, luckily, when I was coming down, there wasn't really anybody coming down at the same time. But yeah, the steps were very steep. And I think on the way down, I hit my backpack a couple of times because there just wasn't very much space. But there was a good view from up
Yeah.
there. Yusuf told us to go later, but I don't think I could because of the timing. So I had to go a little bit earlier in the afternoon than I wanted.
Right.
But yeah, great view of the beautiful walled city of Kiva.
And as we're wrapping up
Very cool.
Uzbekistan, let me bring Bill back again.
Other highlights for me are the 3 Silk Road cities in Uzbekistan that we visited. And you and I talked before that we were glad that we did them in the order that we did. And I agree with that. Although it's interesting, the order was Samarkand, then Bukhara, then Khiva. And Khiva was my favorite city because it was this walled, very compact city. You could get from anywhere in the city to any other spot within 5 minutes of walking. It's very compact, very scenic.
Right.
I loved it there. But I thought that the most memorable monuments were in Samarkand. The visit we made
Yeah,
there
that
to the
makes sense.
Registan, and then also the Shah-e Zinda.
Mm-hmm.
Those are both ones that I'll never forget, where some of the other mosques and madrasas that we visited in some of the other cities, I have a more difficult time remembering. Yeah. Yes,
remembering them,
exactly.
keeping them straight. So the Shy Zinda, I haven't talked about that much.
It
What
was just
stuck in your mind
unique
about that one?
that we were walking up this staircase and there were colorful monuments on both sides of us. And it was just very
Hmm.
different than anything else we saw. Yes,
Much smaller space, right? When you say monuments on the sides, like in Rajasthan, you've got monuments on two sides of a big square, but here you've
yes.
got an alleyway in between these smaller monuments. Quite beautiful. I was struck by that as well. I love some of the pictures that I took in the Shai Our Zinda. Closing dinner. Now, very few of the dinners were included. I think 2 dinners were included, so you're paying on your own. But honestly, sometimes we were paying $4 or $5 a person, so the meals were pretty cheap here. Now it was tens of thousands of mott, and then you'd go, "Oh my gosh, that seems like too much," and then you do calculations. Bill and Crystal, for instance, ordered I think 5 or 6 dishes at one restaurant when we were in Turkmenistan, and it seemed like they were spending a lot of money, and it turned out that they were spending $11. So but at that dinner, we said goodbye to the one guide, and in G, they're called your CEO. So the CEO for Uzbekistan was Mohammed, and the CEO for Turkmenistan was Yusuf. And so we said goodbye to Mohammed and hello to Yusuf, met him, and started talking about that part of the trip. The next day, we got up and drove into the northern part of Turkmenistan. I should say that these two countries are both about the size of the state of California. So Uzbekistan is just about 5% larger than California, but with 40 million people, so more people than California. Turkmenistan is about 5% larger than Uzbekistan, but with only 7 million people. And while Uzbekistan gets something like 20 million visitors a year, Turkmenistan only gets 20,000 visitors a year. And when you're at the border, you think that maybe they would have to improve that situation if they wanted to get more visitors. So you get to the border. We try to get there early. It opens at 9. We were hoping to get there before 9 to wait early in line, but everybody else had the same idea. So there was a scrum of people at the Uzbekistan side that flowed in some unnatural ways. It wasn't necessarily the first people there who got in first. They seemed to be letting us as tourists in a little ahead. We cleared Uzbekistan once we got through the gates. It was relatively orderly to get your passport stamped. And then we crossed over and got in a bus, crammed a number of people into the bus on the Turkmenistan side of the border. I didn't think we could fit that many people into a bus, had to pay $1 for that ride. And then you have to pay $110 at the Turkmenistan border. You have to get a COVID test, even though they didn't read your COVID test, or at least they didn't read it while we were still there. But I really wanted to take my wife, who is a project manager, and have her spend some time reorganizing this thing because it didn't make a lot of sense in terms of how the process worked on the Turkmen side of the border. You have to have a guide, and the guide was dealing with everything, but there was just a crowd of people, no particular order of things, people pushing into the windows. You had to get your visas. Yusuf collected all our passports, went up there, waited for at least half an hour to get the visas, and then you have to get the paperwork so you can get the COVID test, then you get the COVID test, and then you have to pay your money. And meanwhile, people are going back and forth through a door with a guard on it because they haven't lined everything up so that it would be in an orderly process. And then once you've got all that, then you go and Yusuf took our money. He went and paid it. He got the receipts. Then we finally went and got our passports stamped, went through one more set of screening for our luggage, and we were in Turkmenistan where we met our bus and went to Dashaguz. And let me bring back Bill to talk about his experience at the border.
Oh, there
Bill,
were
what was the highlight
several.
for you?
I think I have to talk about that border crossing into Turkmenistan, which was
As a
it was
highlight, you
very
say.
memorable, quite chaotic. And I don't want it to sound negative because the impression I came away with was our CEO at G Adventures was just fantastic at navigating that for us. And as you remember, there was a woman there
Right.
who had another tour agency, and it was not so good for her. And I'm not sure when or if she ever did get to cross the border. So, yeah,
They didn't show up, which is really bad. And apparently, as we learned from that, and then also from the woman we met in the National Museum, you can't get in without a guide. Literally can't get in. Not just is it more difficult, and I'm not sure I would have wanted to try and navigate that without a guide anyway.
yeah,
Literally,
exactly.
it just isn't a thing. And Dashaguz is in the northern part of Turkmenistan. There is population in the north, a lot of population in the east, and then again in the south with the capital city, and then population in the west along the Caspian Sea, and in the middle, nothing. There is really no big cities in the middle. It's desert, and that's where we're headed to see the Darvaza gas crater. I want to say a little bit about money because we were told before we left Uzbekistan that we needed to get $350, and we didn't know if that was a requirement. It is not, but it was a recommendation. There's 110 you need to pay in US dollars in all crisp dollars. This has to look like new currency at the border. You pay that in US, that $1 then for the bus. And then the rest of this is just to have money to exchange. There is an official exchange rate, which is something like 3.5 som to every dollar. But there's an unofficial exchange rate, which is 15 to 1 or 18 to 1 to the US dollar. And so if you used your credit card, which you could use, you would be paying way too much money. So instead, the drivers were acting as an unofficial currency exchange person, exchanging our crisp US dollars at a rate of 15 to 1 into som. And it's sort of one of those what happens in the bus stays in the bus kind of moments. So we paid for everything in the country in cash and tried to have not much cash left over at the end, because if you exchanged it back at the airport, you'd only get 3.5 to 1 instead of 15 to 1. Uzbekistan only had one exchange rate, and so we paid for most things with our credit cards. So when we were eating in restaurants, we were paying with credit cards, and then tried to use up the rest of our mot as part of the tip. They recommend a tip for your CEO at something like $7 to $10 per day, and tipping drivers something like $3 to $5 per day. Back to the trip. First, we went to Dashaguz and went out to the site of Konya Urgench. And Konya Urgench is the ancient capital of the Khwarezmian Empire. And so this is the empire that would have included Khiva as well. There's not a whole lot left from when the Mongols went through, but there's a very tall, kind of leaning minaret, as well as a couple mausoleums there to some of the rulers there in Konya Urgench. But interesting to see that very historic city. Konya Urgench means old Urgench because basically at some point over on what is now the Uzbek side of the border, they decided to build new Urgench. The next day, before we went down to the Darvaza gas crater, we did a tour of the city and saw some of the main government buildings, because this is the head of this one of 5 regions in Turkmenistan. If you look at the Turkmenistan flag, this is interesting. There are 5 different stars and a crescent, one for each of the regions. There's also 5 different carpet patterns. I don't know of any other flag that includes carpet patterns, but the Turkmen are really proud of their carpets. To get an idea of the architecture in modern Turkmenistan, this is Turkmenistan since independence, think something that Donald Trump would like. Lots of gold, lots of white marble. And that will give you a picture of the style of the buildings that are being built. And the other thing that is notable is they like these sort of things where if you have a library, it looks like a book. Or in Ashgabat, when you have the petroleum ministry, it looks like an oil derrick. So they really like those kind of designs. And so we did a quick visit to some of these buildings in Dashaguz, and we visited the market as well. We spent about an hour at the market exploring it, quite a large market there. Although the particular group that we had this time, none of us were really shoppers, so we didn't do a lot of shopping in the market, but it's still great for people watching and spending some time looking at what sort of goods are available for sale there. Because, again, they don't get many tourists. This is not a tourist market. There just aren't really tourist markets because they only have 20,000 visitors a year. I use my cell phone pretty much constantly while I'm traveling, and that's just not to stay in touch, but that's also navigation, translation, information. So I need data. Don't be buying that expensive plan from your carrier to use overseas, and don't be getting a SIM from the airport. These days, you can get an eSIM, for instance, from our sponsor, Saley, today. With an eSIM, you don't have to physically put anything different in your phone. Just download the Saley app and choose an appropriate plan. It might be a plan just for one country, global or regional plan. With Saley, an eSIM needs to be installed only once, so you don't have to even install a new SIM for each country, and you can have your data where you want when you need it. And because Saley is sponsoring Amateur Traveler, you can get an exclusive 15% discount on Saley eSIM data plans. Download the Saley app and use the code Amateur Traveler at checkout. Get an exclusive 15% discount on Saley data plans. Use code Amateur Traveler at checkout. Download the Saley app or go to Saley.com/amateur traveler. And that's Saley, Saily. And thanks to Saley for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Mom, can you tell me a story?
Sure. Once upon a time, a mom needed a new car.
Was she brave?
She was tired, mostly. But she went to Carvana.com and found a great car at a great price. No secret treasure map required.
Did she have to fight a dragon?
Nope, she bought it 100% online. From her bed, actually.
Was it scary?
Honey, it was as unscary as car buying could be.
Did the car have a sunroof?
It did, actually.
Okay, good story.
Car buying you'll want to tell stories about. Buy your car today on
Carvana.
Delivery fees may apply.
And then we got in 4x4s and headed off to Darvasa. We really wanted to get to Darvasa before dinner time, and in the later part of the day, we didn't have to drive through the hot part of the day, and we wanted to be there as the sun was going down, which is easier to see the gas crater. And most of the way, we were actually on a highway. But the way this highway is, it's really very potholed. So you would go on the highway and then you'd veer off into the sand and then back onto the highway. And only in the last part are you fully off-road in the dunes. It's a rough road. Yusuf told us that Turkmenistan is working on their highways, but they're doing it where the people live, starting in the south and then in the east. You've probably heard of this Gates of Hell gas crater. This is not a naturally occurring thing. What happened was the Soviets were drilling for natural gas, and they were told by someone higher up to do it faster than usual, to do it in a hurry. And so normally you would dig down 10 meters, and then you would put a concrete cap of so many meters, and then you'd dig down another 10 meters and you'd put another concrete cap of so many meters, and you'd carefully do this so that if you hit gas, it wouldn't come back up the pipe and you'd have more control of that. And if you don't do that carefully, then you end up with gas leaking, which is what they ended up with. They had this gas leaking because their caps didn't work. They didn't wait for the cement to cure. And at some point they went, oh, animals are dying near here because of the gas that is coming out. I know what we'll do. We'll just light it, thinking that this is something that would go out relatively quickly. Well, it has been burning for decades. Now, it's burning much less than it did before, probably half of what you've seen some pictures of, but it's still the world's largest fire pit. Interesting to see at night and the end of day. So very hot, as you might imagine, probably burning through, someone estimated, about $200,000 worth of natural gas a day. So the people of Turkmenistan have been looking for a way to actually shut this off. While it might be a nice tourism site, tourism is not an emphasis in Turkmenistan. Now, it is an emphasis in Uzbekistan. One of the big differences between the two countries, since independence, the first president of Uzbekistan wanted them to focus on growing cotton, and everybody had to get out there and pick cotton when the cotton was ready, including the doctors and the nurses, and had to go out in the fields and pick cotton. Well, later on, the second president of Uzbekistan said, no, we're not going to focus on cotton. We're going to focus on tourism. And that's why they get a lot of tourism, is why they're very ready for tourism, and why you see these touristy cities like we saw. Turkmenistan does not focus on tourism, so they don't get that many. You have to have a guide. You have to have a letter inviting you, and they're just really not focused on that. So that was the Darvasa gas crater. We stayed in yurts that night. No showers, only a light that was lit from batteries from solar power, flush toilets still, and a very good meal. And then we went back out again to the gas crater at night with our flashlights to get there, but it was close enough to walk to from the yurts. There's at least 3 different yurt camps in the area, but again, still not that large a number of tourists. There were 3-4 other groups there while we were there as well. We were the smallest group by far everywhere we went, because there were just the 5 of us plus the guide. And let me bring Bill back on to talk about the gas crater.
I think I told you that my wife said that going to the gas crater was her favorite part, which...
You did?
Yeah, which I like the gas crater. It seems a little more subdued than it probably was in the past, but that was interesting. But she tends to like, I was going to say, more nature or natural things, and this really isn't natural. It was man-caused.
You're basically at the scene of an industrial accident. So I was fascinated that our guide, Usuf, told us that the Turkmen people didn't even know about this for, it sounded like, decades until the Russians left. The Russians didn't tell them that we accidentally blew up this gas deposit and it's still on fire.
Yeah, that amazed me as well. I was quite surprised by that.
The one thing I liked about that trip is that it really was a trip also into the desert. I know if Tom were on, one of the things that he enjoyed was when our car broke down, and not that our car broke down, but the shepherd's hut and the sheep pen that we saw and the little tracks in the sand and just all of the things that we could see in that unexpected stop in the desert.
Yeah. And in one of our yurt camps, he was also quite fascinated with the dung beetle that he found.
Oh my gosh, yes. I forgot all about that. Which was pretty cool, honestly.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I'd never seen that before. So I thought,
I've seen a dung beetle rolling dung. I've never seen it hide its dung for later. I don't know what the story was, but building a hole and putting a ball of dung down in the hole and burying it. The next day, as we were leaving the gas crater, we were going up one of the sand dunes on the way out. And this is why we have our 4x4s. And at some point, the 4x4 would not go into gear. I thought we were going to be stuck there for hours, but fortunately what they do is the drivers basically in the north and in the south spend half a day driving to the gas crater and then half a day driving back. And so a set of drivers had slept at the gas crater and were now heading south. And because the groups are going from north to south or south to north, you don't necessarily have a match of how many cars you need in both directions. So there were empty spaces, fortunately, in the cars that were heading south. And so they called back one of the cars. We got in and were able to continue on relatively quickly. We did skip the mud crater that you usually stop at because the group that was in the car that we were sharing had already been there. We went to the water crater, which is another crater that I'm not sure how it was formed, with some very green water down below, not for swimming. It's both inaccessible and probably fairly toxic from the color of the water. And then we're driving through the desert for hours, probably about 4 hours to get down to Ashgabat. And Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan. An earthquake in 1948 destroyed much of Ashgabat, so it is a new city. And then since independence, there are all these great big boulevards with 6 lanes in each direction and trees that have been planted in this great reforestation project that's trying to prevent desertification, and great big white marble and gold buildings. And then some of the significant buildings that we toured the next day were the Monument to Independence, which had Turkic leaders around it, about a dozen different statues of famous Turkmen. So people who would be famous in the 24 different tribes of Turkic peoples. So not just the Turkmen tribes, but also other leaders. And then we went to the Monument of Neutrality. And so one of the big things that they are proud of in Turkmenistan is that they have officially declared themselves a neutral country like Switzerland, registered with the United Nations, and all that means. Like, they can't make weapons, they can only have defensive military forces, they can't have missiles. And so some people have talked about Turkmenistan as being a little weird and have used the phrase the North Korea of Central Asia. And I think that's a very misleading phrase. There are some things that are weird about Turkmenistan. We'll talk about it a little bit in terms of it being a little more closed, but it's not a closed country, first of all. And also, they're not putting all their money into weapons and things like that. Their people are well fed, unlike people in North Korea, and they're really focusing more on their petroleum and natural gas production and on using that money on their people. I don't know how the leaders live. We did not meet them, but the people we met there seemed very happy, very normal. You know, we went to shopping malls. There's plenty to eat. It's very Western feeling in that fashion, except for, you know, more people are wearing headscarves. But really, even that, both of these countries are secular countries. I think I saw one woman in a veil the whole time we were there. It's traditional in Turkmenistan that a married woman would wear a headscarf, but not covering all her hair. And it's more tradition than religious. And some certainly didn't wear headscarves at all. But there are some things that are a little odd. Like, I think you have to have a white car when you live in Ashgabat, which is probably a law that I don't know that you really need. And then also, we saw the students in their school uniforms, which is very normal, having school uniforms. The women's school uniform, though, is a cap and a long green dress. This is, I think, high school. And then pigtails. Well, if you don't have long hair, you wear extenders so that you can have pigtails, even if you can't have pigtails. That, again, is a law that I'm not sure that anybody needs. So there's a few things that are weird, but generally, when we met the Turkmen people, they were friendly, they were polite, they were happy, they were on their cell phones like we were. So a different approach to independence than Uzbekistan, but, you know, to each their own. So we had off that day, and it's quite warm by this point, and so some of us just took a break. That we were staying in a hotel. Everything is not in walking distance in Ashgabat, and you don't have the app for calling cabs. You just wave down with your hand kind of pointing down at an angle, and someone will stop and you offer them money to take you someplace, and they may or may not be a cab. I don't think any of us really tried that. And you can't really walk to any place because it's just quite far and it was quite hot. All these buildings are set far apart in this kind of planned city fashion, as if there were another million or 10 million people in Ashgabat. There's 1 million people, so it's not a small city, but it is set up as if it were a much larger city than that. One of the cool things we did the next morning is we went out to Nisa, and Nisa is an old Parthian city. It's the capital of Parthia. And if you're not familiar with Parthia, they're contemporaries of the Romans. The Romans fought against Parthia. In fact, Julius Caesar, who was part of the first triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus got this idea in his head that he wanted a military victory, even though he was not a military man. And he led 40,000 people out in the desert where they were defeated by 10,000 Parthians on their horses, firing backwards as they pretended to retreat in what is called a Parthian shot. So one of Rome's biggest losses were these legions that were lost by Crassus out here to the people of Parthia. And this was their first capital. The Parthians were apparently one of the 3 branches of the Scythians, if you're familiar with them. And much of the capital was built with adobe or with non-fired bricks, and so quite a lot of it had melted. You could still see where the walls had been, but they didn't have a firm wall shape anymore. And they had done some reconstruction to preserve or to at least stop other walls from degrading. So the Parthians, since this is 2,000 years ago, the religion in most of this area was Zoroastrianism, as I mentioned. And so you would have the sacred fire, because Zoroastrianism has a lot to do with the worship of fire, and they have their fire temples. They also practiced something like the sky burials, where you take the body when somebody dies to a temple where it is eaten by scavengers, and then you bury the bones and things like that. So it's interesting to see the Zoroastrian in sort of its original form here in the Parthian capital. And this capital, like the place we went in the north, Konya or Gench, are both UNESCO World Heritage Sites. There is a third UNESCO World Heritage Site in Turkmenistan, and that is Merv, MERV. And we've talked about it on the show before. It is not part of this tour, but two of the members of the trip, Susan and Tom, were staying extra days, and they were able to fairly easily arrange a day trip out there. I think if I had known ahead of time it was that easy to do, I probably would have gone there as well. We also spent an hour in the National Museum and got to see a lot of the artifacts that have been collected from the various historical places in Turkmenistan. And Turkmenistan, again, has just this layer upon layer of history, including the Greeks, including the Persians, including the Mongols. And so, very interesting museum. I would highly recommend it. We could have spent more time there if you wanted to read all the descriptions. We had a wonderful English-speaking guide who was a local university student. And of course, this being Turkmenistan, we also saw what used to be the largest carpet in the world, but is now the second largest carpet in the world. There is a fee if you want to take pictures here or at either of the two UNESCO World Heritage Sites that we went to. But I think that fee was only about $5. The other thing I should say about Turkmenistan is that you need a VPN. So while you may find Wi-Fi in your hotel, which we did, except for when we're out by the yurts, it doesn't mean you can get to the sites you normally want to get to. And our guide recommended the Jump VPN, and I wish I had downloaded it before I got to the country. And that's the trip. At that point, we went to the airport in the next morning. Those of us who were leaving and flew out, most of the flights going through Istanbul. There are also flights that go through Dubai, which definitely impacted the tourism this year in Turkmenistan. A lot of the Australians who come in through Dubai, and the war with Iran interrupted a lot of that tourism. And as we wind down this episode, let me bring Bill back on to talk about some overall thoughts on the trip and then also our wrap-up questions.
I guess the other thing that sticks out to me is just the people. I really didn't know
Yeah.
what to expect. Never been in this part of the world before, and didn't have, except for that border crossing, didn't have a negative experience with anybody the whole time. And we were constantly around people who were hawking souvenirs and things like that. But there wasn't any negative experiences. And we had some great experiences with young people who wanted to take pictures with us or who wanted to practice their English. And I just came away from the trip with just being very impressed with the people that live in both those countries.
What surprised you?
Like I said before, the kindness of the people and how welcoming they were. I don't know if you talked about going to that woman's house where she made the bread for us in the tandoor oven, and speaking with the teenagers there. And I really enjoyed that experience as well.
Yeah, so no, I didn't talk about it. I forgot all about it. But yeah, so we got to see how a tandoori oven works. I didn't know that tandoori was a Central Asian thing, that I'm used to it being Indian cuisine. Apparently, the Moguls brought it in from Central Asia. Factoid I didn't know there. But yeah, you talked about the kids who were on their cell phones and wanting to know our Instagrams and connecting. And then I know Susan was getting messages from these kids days later.
That's right.
Just really were interested in connecting. And these kids who lived out in a rural village, definitely not in the city. The one mother was doing this, I think, on a fairly regular basis, working with G to provide this cultural experience, but still of a unique thing for them, obviously, to have a group of Americans come by. us being all Americans in this particular group. Yeah, it was very interesting. And honestly, the bread was great too.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
What did you think was going to be the highlight of the trip going in?
I thought it was going to be those Silk Road cities that we mentioned
Yeah.
before. I thought it was going to be Samarkand and Bukhara and Khiva. And that's what I had read about the most. So I figured that was going to be it. But everything was great. I didn't really know as much about those ancient cities, Nisa and the other one in Turkmenistan that we visited. And I enjoyed those visits as well. It was a little bit different than Uzbekistan, where, they hadn't put the time into restoring them like they looked like originally, but I enjoyed those visits as well and didn't really know what to expect there.
And then you were taking a lot of photos. I think probably the biggest photographer on the trip. Have you had a chance to look at your photos yet? And what are your favorites?
I've gone through what I have on my iPhone. I haven't gone through what I have on my camera yet. But I think you know this, that I got up early each morning in each town and walked around so I could get some pictures with less people. And so the lighting was a little bit better. And I tried to stay out right before dusk so that I could get some better lightings.
Magic hour.
Yeah, I looked at some of them as we were going, and I was really happy with a lot of them. I got some really good reflections. I don't know if you remember in Bukhara, there was all of the pools,
the ponds,
that were in front of some of the madrasas, and I got some really good pictures of the reflection there in those pools.
Anything else you could think that people need to know before they go to, let's do it one at a time, Uzbekistan? They were very different, the two countries.
Yeah, I don't know if you've talked much about the difficulty in Turkmenistan in getting checking in for your flight, for example, but
or not being able to check in for my flight at all. Yeah,
yeah, that did make things a little bit difficult. Yusuf encouraged us to download that Jump
VPN.
Yeah, VPN, which worked great for us, but I don't think you had the same experience.
No, I wasn't able to download it. So it's a good thing to say is you should probably download that and maybe a couple other VPNs before you get into the country. Because I tried to use my regular VPN and it didn't help me.
Yes, like you, I worked all during the trip. Having a couple of days where I couldn't do as much work was probably a good thing. I could focus more on just being there and enjoying the trip.
I'm going to give you a shot at the typical ending questions for the episode.
Okay.
So if I ask you, you're standing in the most beautiful spot in either country that we saw, where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I'm going to say that balcony from the restaurant where we had our closing dinner in Uzbekistan.
Khiva,
in Khiva, in Uzbekistan. The sun's going down. We had a beautiful view from the height of being up on that top floor of the restaurant and just saw the minarets and other monuments of the city. And that was a great way to end that part of the trip.
Cool. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Uzbekistan or only in Turkmenistan?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to say a couple of the things that we've talked about already about Turkmenistan, right? That border crossing was just something else. In the airport, I think I mentioned that I'd never seen a place where my passport was checked so many times.
So many times.
And my luggage was
10 feet from the last guy who checked your passport, and there was no other way that you could get from one to the other. Do you think that other guy isn't doing his job?
Yeah, and I think that there were at least 3 times that my luggage had to go through some kind of screening, which sometimes in some airports there is. When you first walk into the airport, it has to be screened, and then there's another screening. But my recollection is there were at least 3 screenings of the luggage, and I don't know how many times.
2, but okay, it was more than 1.
And I don't know how many times my passport was checked. If I had to guess, I would say 5.
My gosh, about right.
So, yeah.
And if you had to summarize this trip in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Oh, I'm going to go with 3 M's. Madrasas, mosques, and minarets. How about that?
I feel like you were ready for that question. Who would you recommend this G Adventures trip with? Obviously, they won't be able to go with us, but who should go on this trip?
Oh, I think anybody could go on this. I think it's probably going to be people who are well traveled, like our whole group was, but I can't think of anybody who I think it would be too much for. Even if you haven't traveled to a lot of places, there's going to be a little bit of culture shock.
Not as much as other places I've been, like India, for instance.
Yes.
That trip, while I loved it, terrific trip, great group of people as well, it is a difficult country in some ways because of the poverty. And this didn't have any of that. Uzbekistan especially just seemed easy to travel in.
Yes, I agree. Although I'm sure you're going to give a shout out to our CEOs because they were both just fantastic and certainly made it a lot easier. And these countries will be visited, like I said, by people who have already probably been a lot of other places, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, I don't think, especially if you go with somebody like G Adventures who just made everything so easy. I think probably the roughest part of the trip for any of us was the 2 nights in the yurts.
At least the second yurt, maybe, where I didn't have Wi-Fi.
And the shower situation.
Actually, they weren't bad. The shower situation, the second one. That's true. Okay. I'd say the first one I didn't think was difficult at all, but I would have gone with the roads. But
yes.
We did bounce around a bit.
That is true. Lots of massages on the road.
Yep. A special thanks to Bill for coming on the show. He took some time from work. That's one of the reasons we had him on a cell phone here, not quite as good a microphone, but I appreciated him taking the time so I could get this show out before I leave again on another trip. And also thanks to Crystal and Tom and Susan. They were great traveling companions. And as Bill said, a big helping heap of thanks to Mohammed and Yusuf for being great tour guides, great CEOs. And that was our trip. And I'm sorry you missed it. And if you missed it because you thought it might be too challenging, then I'm doubly sorry.
Support comes from Wise, the smart way to manage the currencies you need around the globe. Fed up with losing out to hidden fees when you send money abroad with your everyday bank? Choose the smart way, Wise. You can count on the exchange rate you'd usually find on Google. No unwelcome surprises. Plus, ditch that where's my money feeling. Most transfers arrive in under 20 seconds. Join millions saving billions on hidden fees. Be smart, get Wise. Download the Wise app today. T's and C's apply.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Here's a little tune to help you remember. Same drive, different day. Don't you wish you were getting away? Pack your bags and come on through. Texas, Ohio, Alaska, we're up there too. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Well, I hope you like my little song. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
A special thanks also to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. And thanks to all the people who have traveled with me here over the years as we reach the 1000th episode. I think this was the 8th Amateur Traveler trip. We have been to Egypt. We've been twice to Morocco, Southern Africa, India, Cambodia, and then a trip to Europe to Prague, Krakow, and Budapest. I have enjoyed all those trips, and I'm also planning on enjoying next year's trip in May to Bolivia. If you're interested in learning more about that, go to amateurtraveler.com/trips, which is a private Facebook group, or just drop me an email and I will tell you more information. Thanks so much for listening to this special 1000th episode. Thank you so much for those of you who have listened to all 1000 episodes, to both of you. As we go forward, we've got some great shows coming up as well. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to chris2x@gmail.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And as always, thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Few things are truly timeless, because to last, you can't stand still. That's the beauty of Michigan. You can feel it everywhere, like a fresh breeze on a riverfront stroll, or how the nightlife hums with electricity, like an old friend with new stories to tell. So let the excitement bring you back and bring you together, season after season, in pure Michigan. Find your season at michigan.org.
Are you one of those media strategy people clicking through slides, scrolling spreadsheets? Yes? Good. This is for you. Because on Spotify, there's an audience that's different, locked in, loyal, invested. They're called fans. Fans don't just listen to music, they feel seen by it, like it belongs to them. So when your brand shows up on Spotify, that's who you're talking to. And you're right next to artists like me, Lizzo. So, are you ready to talk to fans? Spotify advertising. You're among fans.